Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site, covering Arizona Cardinals. And with me recording on a Tuesday night, after a long day, and granted, we're getting results of elections and yada, 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 big time of year, big time in life. We're talking football. It's Tuesday night with my co-host, Seth Cox from EventToTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site. And we get to talk about something more fun and far less serious, and that is the Arizona Cardinals and a win. The Cardinals not only beat the Chicago Bears, it was a beatdown. They beat the Bears 29-9 on Sunday afternoon at home. And my goodness, Seth, they've won 3 in a row and 4 out of 5. What is this team right now? Dare I say, they are on the cusp of going on a run if they're not careful, right? And it's really hard to, temper expectations, but you can only play. They survived the hardest part of the schedule, and now they have a very winnable part of their schedule coming up over the next few weeks.
Yeah, and that's what we talked about, is getting out of this stretch of games. Obviously next week, and we'll talk about the Jets game, but getting out of this stretch of games and going into the bye week 500 was what we wanted to see. Now they've done that, and I know that they haven't played the Jets yet, so you're like, what are you talking about? They can't be below 500. I mean, they're guaranteed to be at worst 5-5 at the bye week, and let's be honest, that's not something that we saw coming based on how the 2-4 started. We weren't overly shocked by 1-2. The thrashing of the loss to the Washington Commanders.
Washington and Green Bay were just they puzzled us because it felt like they were unscheduled. They were winning sometimes and they're losing competitively, but the 2 games where they got the doors blown off and we're like, okay, the rebuild's over. Like, isn't our fan base funny? We're so quick to bail. Is it? Have we been traumatized that much to believe that the first little bit is like, oh, never mind, it's over?
but it wasn't just that, Jess. It was how they were losing those games, like you said. Like, it wasn't competitive, and that wasn't the expectation. The expectation was, like you said, like competitive losses. Like, hey, you can lose to the Buffalo Bills or Detroit Lions, and you're like, they're just not quite on that level yet. But to lose by 4 touchdowns to the Washington Commanders, you're like, what is happening? And then you feel like that rebound happened against the Niners, and then to get your doors blown off by the Packers, you're like, okay. And that was the conversation. Like, what is this team? And then to rattle off 3 wins, 2 by last second field goals, and then to come out on Sunday at basically a road game at home against the Chicago Bears.
That was unreal what that stadium what that was. We're used to a heavy road fan presence.
It was probably
what I saw
over 70, wouldn't you say?
It was definitely over half. It was a sea of blue and orange in that stadium. It was. I've been going to games as media since 2012. I don't know, like, just the initial look. There's been times like the Steelers game, some Seahawks games, because of the way the games are going, the the crowd takes over, the opposing crowd takes over. But just the appearance of all those Bears fans in the stadium, and I know we have so many Bears fans here, so many Chicagoans here. You know, one was one of my students, and I got a good, I got to make fun of him and his team this yesterday, but
Well,
that was incredible. And remember that home field advantage we used to talk about at State Farm Stadium? Oh my gosh, that is so not a thing anymore.
well, and not just that, but then you look at it. What was wild to me is the way that the Cardinals dominated that game was probably as unexpected as rain falling in the stadium. Right?
Yes.
Like that's, and I know I'm being, cheekish here, but like the reality of the Cardinals coming out in a game against a 4-3 team. Now we knew those 4 wins were not impressive wins, something that you and I had talked about already, but coming out against a 4-3 team and dominating on both sides of the ball along the line was not something that we expected. We thought that the Bears offense would be able to move the ball consistently, as the Cardinals have, consistently given up yards in games, and they've found ways. The Dolphins had 377 yards of offense, Jess. The Chargers had 395 yards of offense. Like we weren't expecting 250 yards, right? Like that wasn't the expectation. The expectation was they're going to move the ball. Can they get stops in the red zone? And the fact that they initially allowed some yards to occur and then got those stops, and then just completely in every facet and phase of the game dominated, was just not anything that we could have imagined. The way that this game unfolded was completely surprising. And, I know it wasn't the performance from Kyler that some people would have loved to have seen, but the performance from the team as a whole was so dominant and so impressive that you have to say this was probably their second best game of the year after the Rams game, right?
Yeah. So what do you think of this team now as they sit at 5-4, alone in first place in the NFC West? What's your feeling about this? Is this a team that is overachieving, or has it found itself and knows what it is? And I'm not saying they're going to go on a run, but do you think that they're going to ride this wave through the rest of the season?
And that's the hard part, because what happened this week was so unexpected. And then, like you said, we're kind of that scorned lover, right? Like, they don't do it consistently, so I can't just like go all in. But man, that looked really good, and like it was a lot of fun, and everybody else is enjoying it and having a lot of fun, right? But the reality is they've not never obviously, but this group hasn't shown that propensity. So you're like, okay, how do I dip my toe back in and buy in without setting myself up for a prime Aaron Rodgers performance where he throws for 400 yards and 4 touchdowns, and the Cardinals lose in just epic, humiliating fashion at home. And so that's what it is. It's like I'm buying what they're selling, but I'm only going to buy a part of it until I see more, right?
So will you jump on Will you get more excited if it's 6-4 going into the bye?
Yeah, I mean, definitely you have to be, because 6-4 and at least one game up, and I know that they've played an additional game, but one game up in the NFC West, because they hold the tiebreakers with the Rams and the Niners so far.
Yeah.
So,
and then and that Seahawks team, they've lost 4 out of 5. They've lost 5 out of 6, mind you. The Vikings, like, that's a tough game. Not gonna lie, that's a tough game. But even at 6-4, you win one of those 3 games afterwards. And if you go into that, 6-4 into the bye, you feel like you will win one, probably can win 2, right? If you go 2-1 in those next 3 games, and you're 8-5, and then you're staring down the Patriots and the Panthers, you're like 10-5 going into the last 2 weeks of the year. You pick up one of those games, you're locking up the division. That's like, you start looking ahead, and I know that's foolish. Fan-wise, it's fun and foolish. Analyst-wise, we can start looking ahead and saying, wow, this team is on track. This team is on track.
yeah, and that's what the goal is, right? Like, to be on track. And I don't want to understate how much they're improved and how much better they're looking, right? Like, it's getting better. But the reality becomes at the same time too, like, this is a group that we haven't seen consistency from. So, like, that's where we want to see things first, right? Is like, how does this go moving forward? And then from there, continuing to see this group grow into what we want to see, because we know what the flaws are still, right? They're definitely an overachieving bunch defensively right now.
Yes.
And so how do they get past that, and how do we make sure that they are, like you said, for real, like they're competing for real?
Yeah.
And that's the biggest question I have for this group overall.
Let's start talking about that. Coming up next in the rest of this year podcast, the Best Our Cardinals talk about. Let's talk about the offense. What did we see offensively? We'll go on the defense after that, and we'll talk about a trade that happened. That's coming next in Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, Best Our Cardinals talk about. Talk about the offensive side of the ball. My goodness, was a fantastic game, and it starts just with starts with the run game. It continues with their third down production, and it goes even further with their red zone production. But what do we have to say about, James Conner goes for 107 yards. Amari DiMercado has 59 yards, including a 53-yard touchdown. Trey Benson has his first NFL touchdown, 37 yards. And even Trey McBride, 3 rushing touchdowns, and none of them come from James Conner. Who would have thought that?
Yeah, it was a wild game, and the way it came about was definitely not something that we expected to see then, right? And the way this team plays as a whole, when they feel like they're producing at a good level, is super interesting to me, because this team really showed, I think, that they're good enough to hang with those teams that are the true upper echelons, right? Like we talked about, teams like the Bills and the Lions this year. Like, they're good enough to hang with those teams, but they're probably not quite ready to beat those teams yet, because there's still players away. But if they're running the ball at a consistent rate, like we saw, they take so much pressure off a defense. And to do it at such a dominant rate in this game was kind of baffling, because we knew that the Bears rush defense wasn't great by any means.
We felt that was an area where they could exploit that defense, and they did quite a bit,
and
by a lot.
Right. And so, but I mean, Jess, we didn't dream of that at all.
No. Well, and even look at that, because guess what? The first 2 possessions that the Cardinals have are like, oh boy, because they went 3 and out and then had 4 plays. So their first 2 drives were abject failures, right? And so we're like, oh boy. But then things happened. Then the things happened. That's the part that was wild there. And they didn't even have their best, like, they made mistakes, right? I mean, they turned the ball over twice. But they just ultimately, it came down to this. Remember how we talked about a Bears team that hadn't given up more than 21 points in a game? They scored 21 points in the first half.
Yeah, that was wild, man. Like, that was utterly wild to see that happen. And it was crazy that it was, I don't want to say easy, but it was crazy that it was so easy. Like you said.
Well, I will say this, the DeMarcado run, that changed the game. I'm pretty sure that changed the game, because at that point it was 14-9, and the Bears had just run their 2-minute offense and got a field goal, leaving 26 seconds left on the clock. And then they bring in, and they could make a couple of get a couple plays to get around, just past midfield. No, they get to midfield, and what do you know? They decide they're playing clock. They're going to try and kick the field goal. Ryland's got that big leg, and they're like, all right, we're trusting our Ryland. They give the ball to DeMarcado. The plan was they ran that play to get 5 yards, and he shoots out of the backfield into the open field, untouched, and outran everyone. And we've seen him do, like, he had, I think it was a 40-yard touchdown last year. So we know he has speed. He's not elite speed, but he has speed. And oh my goodness, I think that play is where the Bears were buried, because they had their when the Cardinals were playing for a field goal, they went out and just they scored a touchdown. Oh, that was fun. That was fun for sure.
Yeah, and it was crazy to see them impose their will on a team that has prided itself throughout its entire existence of being the more physically dominant team, right? Like the team that always is the bully. And I think that's the interesting thing with this group. And I think you would agree with me, is that while we knew it was possible, especially with James Conner, the way that they've all kind of adopted that mentality, even with losing Jonah Williams and Will Hernandez for the season. Well, I know Jonah might come back now, but losing Jonah Williams and Will Hernandez for the season, it was kind of shocking, Jess, and jarring to see just how, again, I hate saying this, like how easy it was to just control the line of scrimmage. Like, Jess, this team had 6 sacks, and don't get me wrong, the Bears' offensive line is nothing to write home about. We talked about that quite a bit, but like, this team had 6 sacks in the game. Again, you and I have said before, would we love 6 sacks a game? Absolutely. But would we prefer getting 2 sacks every game for 3 games in a row over what they have shown, right? Like we'd prefer that a little bit more. And they just haven't done it consistently. So yeah, it's a wild situation right now. I nothing that we expected, and so to see them come out in this game and just physically own the line. I just can't get over it, Jess. Like, I kept looking at my phone because we were out while we were watching it, and I was just like, am I watching the right game? And then the rain started, and I'm like, I'm not watching. Like, this is a dream, right? Like,
it was incredible. It was like, there. I'm like, it's raining in the stadium. Now, I don't know. That was fun. That was fun. And you know, in fairness, there were a couple of things. Is that the Cardinals gave up their sackless streak, and that was even without Montez Sweat. Although I will say, you know, the first sack.
Well, and
I mean, the first sack was Yelda Frohold.
I was gonna say, let's give credit. Let's give credit to Yelda. He got his first sack of his career.
And if you saw on socials, you saw on social media, Yelda make light of it because he totally sacked Kyler. Kyler was scrambling. He ran into, like, Yelda was moving and knocked Kyler over, and a lucky Bears player got credit for that sack. I don't remember which one, but he got sacked 3 times. The Bears did a better job of keeping him from getting out of the pocket. Basically, the times they got him sacked is that he was trying to maneuver within the pocket and break free from the inside rather than moving outside. Like you had a. Sometimes you'll see like a free blitzer come off, go unblocked, or one of the edge guys get free, and so he can go up and around them. He wasn't able to. He didn't ever find himself in a position where he can go back and around the pocket and get into the open field, and that's where ultimately that they got those sacks from. But yeah, the 3 games is good enough, but. Even still, the protection was solid. Kyler was hit only 3 times, and it wasn't like he was under pressure. The 3 times he got hit were the only times he got sacked, and so I consider that still a net positive. We still saw Kelvin Beachum had a much easier game, and I will say this: I must credit the fact that the Cardinals did benefit from Montez Sweat being out, because as we've seen statistically, that Bears defense before Montez Sweat and that defense just by Sweat's presence is so vastly different in efficiency because of the attention you have to give him. That Bears defense that just wasn't great against the run to begin with, the Cardinals offensive line were able to do just what they needed. But yeah, it was like when you get DJ Dallas a carry late in the game, and Clayton Tune got to play, only, he fumbled once. So
Tune struggled this year, man. Like, you almost feel bad for him because you're just like, dude, they want to give you reps. Like, you gotta
Did you see that Desmond Ridder threw a touchdown pass? He got to Aiden O'Connell got benched for Ridder, and cool for Ridder because they were in Cincinnati where he went to college, and he got to play garbage time and went out and had, granted, his yards per attempt isn't great. He went 11 for 16 for 74 yards, but had a touchdown pass, and he threw a 22-yard touchdown pass to rookie Brock Bowers, and the way things are going for the Raiders, Desmond Ridder might be starting here soon. So good for him. That goes forever as the trade that worked out for literally nobody. That was like the biggest nothing trade that the Cardinals and the Falcons made. Rondale Moore, getting him in the last year of his contract, he breaks his leg and he's out for the year. Desmond Ridder gets beaten out by Clayton Tune. Like that deal is the biggest nothing of all time. The most insignificant nothing trade of all time. Both teams, nobody won because they both lost.
Well, and it's just one of those situations where, you're every day you're just going, no, thank God he's staying healthy, because you just see how poor the play is around him.
Oh, yes. With that, anything else do you want offensively that we want I mean, would we have liked to see, okay, things that I wish we had seen? I wish we'd have seen a little bit more of Marv, okay? I wish we'd have gotten more Marv. I wish we could have gotten more in the past game. Wish Kyler's one mistake was missing that layup of a toss into the end zone for Trey McBride. Kyler was pissed after the game. You could tell McBride was disappointed because he wants to get a touchdown reception. He scored 2 touchdowns, mind you. Like, I think people forget that he did. So, well, they look at his stats, you see no touchdowns before the rushing touchdown. He did score a touchdown earlier this year, just wasn't a receiving or a rushing touchdown. He recovered a fumble in the end zone, so he got 6 points. I believe that counted for fantasy, right? That should count for fantasy because he scored a touchdown.
Right, exactly. So, it's one of those situations, and you just see that everything's simmering, and that's the hard part, right? Like, you're like, oh, it's all right that's right at the top. Like, they can do it, and it's not happening, and then people get frustrated, right? Like,
and they want no production from the receivers.
They just want more consistency.
Yeah, they do. We do. In fairness, but if you're winning 29-9, why are we complaining about how they win? If it's 29-9, my goodness. But Harrison had the only 2 receptions by a receiver. Michael Wilson was only targeted once. Greg Dortch was targeted once. He had a terrible drop. Interestingly enough, the one thing that's of note is that Zay Jones he seemed to move ahead of Greg Dortch in terms of Dortch still lists as a starter, but Zay Jones was the one on the field for those 3 wide sets up until like late in the second quarter before Dortch got to play. And so it's interesting. Jones hadn't done anything, but it feels like that was kind of the plan, right? That they wanted to use him more.
I think having Jones is one of those things where you look at it and you go, he's bigger, he's more physical, he fits kind of what they're wanting to do. Dortch has a place and he's in there from a scheme perspective. He has a fit, but it's just he's more of a 4th guy type of guy, right?
Yeah. We'll see how that goes, but like run game good, blocking good, receivers meh, but we didn't need them.
And that isn't that the fun part though?
Yeah,
like,
I guess
you just thoroughly dominate a team that you're just like, oh, this is like embarrassingly easy.
It was. Coming up next on the Rise of Hero podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. Let's move on and talk about the defense, which was also good stuff too. That's coming next on Rise of Red. We're back on the Rise of Red podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. Moving on to talk about the defense. And we know that the Bears have had struggles on the road. And when I talked to Alyssa Barbieri, she downplayed the road factor and played up the opponent factor. I'm still going to say that this young team just doesn't do as well on the road. I will say this. We joked about it. I joked about this in the press box. I said, are you guys ready for a Zaven Collins game? Because they have a 3rd string left tackle. What did we get from Zaven Collins? He had 2 half sacks and a full sack. So he was part of 3 different sacks. They had 6 sacks as a team. Everyone was in on the sack party. But what did we see? We saw Zaven Collins dominating against a backup tackle. And that is fun to see. And it was more than that, but they held the Bears scoreless in the second half. They kept them out of the end zone completely. And, the Bears still haven't scored more than 16 points on the road this year. Caleb Williams, I will say this, super impressed with the way Caleb Williams moves and throws on the move, because that was something to watch in person.
It was, and he's got some talent, man. It's going to be fun to watch, and aren't you glad they don't have to deal with him continuing forward? Only when the schedule dictates, as opposed to every year. So, it was good to get a win on the board early in that, in the Caleb Williams era, because he's got some talent. But man, I do wonder how everything's fitting in there, because some of the effort, and I know that DJ Moore got hurt on that play, so I don't want, that's not the one I'm necessarily talking about, but some of the effort in that game was definitely lacking. And I don't want to take anything away from what the Cardinals did, because I don't think we can say anything but good things about it. But it almost, and maybe it was just how physically dominant the Cardinals were, but it almost was a defeatist opponent. Like, it was weird to see how defeated they were at times.
That's why that DeMarcado touchdown, I think it broke the Bears. It broke them because that's as well. I'll have to pull up. Let me pull up the game book to see what the splits were between the half. I forgot to do that because that's not something I look at. So it's a whole lot. So we look at the first half. So the Chicago Bears, they had 166 yards at halftime. DeAndre Swift had 34 rushing yards. Caleb Williams was 11 for 24 at that point. And then at the end of the game, they had only finished with, wow, 85 yards allowed in the second half. They didn't convert on third down the rest of the game. They didn't convert on third down in the second. That's why it's like when DeMarcado put them up 21-9, and if you look at the possession to start the second half, they went 3 and out. Once they went 3 and out, guess what? They were done. Because then the Cardinals added a field goal after that, and yeah, that was pretty much it.
Yeah, and it was just crazy to see how it all came about, right? Like, this is just
broke.
Yeah, and it's just here's my thing. I truly think that when you can physically beat a team like they did, offensively and defensively, it changes the perception of the game and the way the other team, goes about their business. Because for so long it's been the other way, right? Like, if the Cardinals weren't able to throw the ball, if they weren't high flying, if they weren't putting up points, it was like, oh, this team can't do anything. And then now it's the opposite. And I just don't think anybody's used to that. And so, like you talked earlier about the other portions of it, it's really interesting that fans can't appreciate, and probably just because we've never seen it, the physicality and the ability to control games in a different way, because it's just not something that we've ever seen with this organization. I mean, they talked about it because we have some older fans on the site at Revenge of the Birds, right? And they're like, it reminds us of those 70s Cardinals with that great offensive line. And obviously it's not as good offensive. There's not 3 Hall of Famers on this line.
Yeah, that's crazy.
But that's the type of game that they're playing and winning. And it's wild to think that, because we've never seen it with this group. And so, not this group, just this franchise, right? So it is what it is.
The offensive line has traditionally been a problem.
Right. And so that'll be what's interesting to see moving forward.
You know what really impressed me? And I don't know if I noticed, but did it feel like that the defensive linemen, in particular Dante Stills and LG Collier combined, I for sure, Collier looked so much more engaged and more dominant than we've ever seen him this season. Collier has been pretty meh. He was super active, and maybe in part he was energized by the half sack that he shared with Xavier Thomas. It's funny, like, when they shared that sack and you see them celebrating, Collier had his own thing, like he had planned, and Xavier Thomas was just out of his mind. He didn't have anything planned. He was just going crazy. It was his first NFL sack, but 6 sacks, and the fact there were so many firsts. Jesse Luketa got his first NFL sack. Collier got his first sack at all since he joined the Cardinals. Xavier Thomas got his first NFL sack. Dante Stills has had a partial sack in 3 straight games. Collins was part of 3 sacks. Kaiser had a half a sack. There were just so many good things about that. Budda Baker, statistically, last year it felt like Budda was a little underwhelming. Budda isn't producing much in terms of on the ball this year, but my word, he is impacting games. So far this year, he has broken up only 2 passes up. He doesn't have any interceptions. He hasn't picked up the football at all. But I'm guessing this leads for defensive backs, or maybe I think he leads the NFL in solo tackles right now. At 58, is what Pro Football Reference says, which is wild. So he leads the NFL in solo tackles. He's got 91 combined tackles. And what you are seeing from him is a body flying around making plays. We haven't he's not getting thrown at, but he is impacting games. Aaron Rodgers talked about it. I don't know if it was yesterday or today. I'm guessing it was today on Pat McAfee. And he put Budda in terms of impact of safety in the same category when he's talking about guys that you have to account for. These are Troy Polamalu, Ed Reed, Harrison Smith, and included Budda. That's wild.
Well, and what's crazy about Budda, and to your point, Jess, a couple buddies who have been very pro moving on from Budda for the last probably year, I would say, if not a little longer. During the last 2 games have basically done a complete 180, and they're like, you basically have to re-sign Budda and James Conner at this point.
Yeah.
Like the way that they have set the mentality for this team, you have to keep them, because that's who's, and I don't want to take away anything from anybody else, because I think that everybody's playing, what it was, the high tides raise all ships type of saying. I know I'm screwing that up. But the reality is this group and the way that they're playing, you can't just be like, well, this is the end now, because that's, and I know we're going to talk about this in the final segment, but not going all in at the trade deadline, I'm actually okay with, and we'll talk about that. But it's going to be harder to watch 2 captains and probably the emotional leaders of this team move on, and then and make a case for that is the right decision to make.
It's going to be crazy. But Budda played really well. He's playing it up. Garrett Williams continues to show that he's solid. And I will say this: the defense up front did their job. The edge guys going against backup tackles, and the truth is, that's a positive. Sure, you say, oh, it was against backup tackles, but no. What should you do against backup tackles? What should you do against the third string left tackle? You should make life difficult.
It's what we always talk about, Jess. It's like, oh, the Cardinals look really good, and then you're like, yeah, but it's against their own team, right? You're like, and so for once, it's like, hey, the Cardinals look really good, and it's like, yeah, but it's against backups. It's like, but normally they don't even look good against backups. So to see them, control things so well, it was fun, man. It was a different experience, and I'm at the point now where, you look at everything, and this team, it doesn't have enough to make a Super Bowl run, and even a trade wouldn't have done it. However, it does feel like it has more than enough.
They could win a playoff game
to make a run to the playoffs, and maybe like, because here's the reality:
if they win to the COS, they play at home, so like they could win a wild card game.
Right. And here's the reality. I mean, they don't match up well with teams like Detroit yet, probably not even Kansas City. And that's if they got past Detroit. And quite frankly, they may not match up well with San Francisco once Christian McCaffrey's back.
Right.
But they're good enough to beat the teams that are in that 5, 6, 7 region that you're talking about, and that is a slightly unexpected reality that was just not something we were ready for this year.
Yeah, basically they're an upper mid team. They're mid, like kids like to say. They're mid, but they're on the better side of mid. So we see flashes of, oh wow, okay, this is where they can overachieve. Like their ceiling is good, and then you're like, oh, but basically they are a team that can beat bad teams, that will compete with certain good teams, and depending on the other type of teams, like the other type of good teams, they just don't match up well and get the doors blown off of them.
Right, and that's the big thing though, is don't get the doors blown off, right? Like just
that's the thing. That's the thing. Like when you had such a scrappy good team, a scrappy bad team last year, to then have those big letdowns, that's tough to see, and it happens to NFL teams. It happens all the time. But they've responded both times, and responded in a big way after the last one, after the Green Bay game. They scratched out a win. They looked offensively like we expected, and they completely dominated. So that's what's next. Let's talk about the trade. What happened to the trade deadline? That's coming up next on the Res Here podcast. Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. The trades they made and the trades they didn't. That's coming up next on Rise Up, See Red. Back on the Res Here podcast, Mr. Cardinals Talk on the Web. The Cardinals did make a trade for a pass rusher. No, it wasn't Arden Key. No, it wasn't Azeez Ojulari. No, it wasn't Preston Smith. No, it wasn't Zadarius Smith. No, it wasn't Max Crosby. No, it wasn't Myles Garrett. It was a guy probably most of you had never heard of. Baron Browning. So, underwhelming, but not underwhelming bad, right?
Right, and I like it because I think it's a good move for now and the future. And let me explain that. Okay, so people are going to be like, "Well, it's a 6th-round pick." Yeah, it's a throwaway. I don't care about that. Like, it is what it is. My whole thing is, I feel like even if he puts up, and I don't think it's going to happen. Don't be like, "Oh, Seth said on the show that he was going to do that." No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, even if he goes and puts up 6 sacks to end the season, it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg to re-sign him. Whereas Azeez Ojulari is a free agent as well. He was going to cost a 4th-round pick instead of a 6th, which is, again, to me, you guys know my feeling about that, but not my call. But it was going to be way pricier to sign him. And so what they did is they said, hey, we can go get Azeez in free agency next year if that's what we want to do. But we don't want to box ourselves in to where if Azeez, completes the season he has, finishes with 11, 12 sacks, that's going to get paid probably 18 to 20 million a year, which is ludicrous, but we know how pass rushers go, right?
Right, and that's not even high pass rushers. That's, hey, you're a double-digit sack guy once. Now it's he's going to get $15 to $19 million.
Right, and so the Cardinals are like, hey, Baron Browning, you have the same type of statistical numbers until this season. So show up, give us 6 games. We'll sign you to probably a 2-year, $15 million extension. lets you get out of it after 2 years if you can perform for 2 more years, but we get you in those 2 years as well. Like it's kind of perfect to me. I understand the concern. People are like, well, he's been injured, and he this and that. It's like, look, they weren't going for a home run. The defensive line is just not good.
Well, there's literally only like only two players would have transformed this defense. That's Max Crosby, that's Myles Garrett. Neither one of them got moved. And that there was no Montez Sweat this year. If there were, that's a different story. But it is. I joked about it on Twitter yesterday. I'm like, fans are like, get Aziz, get Arden Key, get somebody. Baron Browning, somebody. And everyone's like, no, not that somebody. And it's underwhelming. It is, because you want for splash and hype version purposes, you want them to go out and make a deal that feels good. It's hard to feel good about the Baron Browning, but as you analyze, if you look at it, the reasoning, he checks a lot of boxes. And I wrote about that today. I said, I think basically 4 reasons why it was a good trade, because you have to know what they were going in. They didn't want to give up draft capital. So clearly the day 2 pick, they didn't want to go to day 2, 6th-round pick, reasonable. A guy that's better than they have. Like talent-wise, by far, he's better than what they've got. John Heath over at Broncos Wire, like he says, he told me, and he wrote to me, I don't published on the site, Browning is a starting caliber edge guy who's had trouble with his durability. Right now, the Cardinals, on their entire roster, and that includes on IR, 2 guys that you would consider starting caliber, Zaven Collins and B.J. Ojulari. Dennis Gardeck was starting. I don't know if you'd consider him starting caliber. He's more, off the bench guy. Julian Okwara, Jesse Luketa, Victor DeMcCagey, Xavier Thomas is a rookie. You wouldn't say any of those guys are starting caliber. They have guys who are starting, but Browning is that. He has already achieved more than B.J. Ojulari. And so, one, he didn't cost much. He's not going to, even if he produces, unless he gets 8 sacks in the final half of the season, then he might get pricey. But you could probably get him for the Zaven deal, which is important, especially when you're thinking about roster management, because they love Zaven. They still believe in B.J. Ojulari, who should be fully healthy next season. And then you add a guy to that in Browning, and then you've got plus you've got the youth of Xavier Thomas. And so it's good roster management as well. Is it the splashy move? Will it make a difference? Will that put them over the top? No, but it makes them better, because he's better than they've got in terms of pass rushing. Wouldn't you probably agree that he has better pass rushing chops than anyone on this roster off the edge, other than B.J. Ojulari? And I'm not even saying because Dennis Gardeck has had production. It's just Gardeck's production comes in waves, and what he does well. But wouldn't you say Browning is probably the second most talented rusher from the edge?
Oh, 100%. And he brings an explosiveness that they've lacked, right? You mentioned Gardeck, and he's similar, athletic profile. He's a little more juiced up, but he's an every down player. And like you said, that's, I don't know, man. The health is the biggest thing for him. If he can stay healthy.
Well, if he stays healthy and he's productive at all, it's a home run.
Right.
Now,
and that's kind of where I'm at with the whole situation. It's not, again, I just feel like people wanted names as opposed to I'll
be like, I would have loved Azeez Ojulari. I would have loved it. for a number of reasons. You also get the storyline where you bring him back next year, even if it costs a lot. They'll have the money for that. But you got both Ojulari brothers. That would be fun, right? That would be fun. And he's a guy that already, like, you're seeing the production now. So he would, I think, make a, more of a long-term there. It's less risk. It's more costly because there's more production certainty, but you feel like he's going to be really good. Arden Key, I would have been good with as well, because like there's the Titans connection with Monty Austinfort. Arden Key is one of those, is a quiet producer in the pass rush. He's not one that many people know, but he's had he's got 4 sacks this year, but he's been a quiet producer. 4 sacks so far this year, 6 last year, 6.5 in 2021 when he played for the 49ers. He's just, he's growing into it, but he's probably not going to be more than that. Browning he's still young enough that should be ascending still in terms of that. And I like it. But like, in terms of value, balancing the value of getting him, the value of bringing him back next year, and the potential he has, I think it's a good move, because like he does improve. Like, he's better than they have.
And here's what I'll say, Jess, and this is my one thing. You and I and this is why I tend to, not allow is such a stupid word, so I don't mean it that way, but like, this is why I tend to just let things go, right? You and I were not huge on the Yelda Froholt signing. We were, in fact,
nope, not at all. We said the entire offseason, what is a Yelda Froholt? And we said they're not going to go into the season with a Yelda Froholt. It's like there's gonna be another move. We said that for months. Okay. He's a solid starting center.
And not just that, he's kind of, again, one of the guys that is setting the tone for this franchise in this change. And it's something that you and I talk about all the time, but the reality being that you can't have an all-pro at every position. You just can't. And I think too often people are like, oh, well, they need this all pro and they need this. It's like, no, that's just not how roster building works. Like it'd be great, don't get me wrong, like we wouldn't be like, oh no, we have this all pro center, this is terrible, but we would be like, oh, okay, this is not, we wouldn't give up other positions for that. And that's kind of how it's working out for them, is that they've got this guy that brings this mentality and this nastiness and this desire, and he works incredibly well with Kyler, and it feels like the entire process is really coming together. And so sometimes getting guys that fit what you're needing to do, as opposed to getting names that is more important. And now I'm not going to say that this is going to be a good trade or anything of that nature, but what I am going to say is that this is a move that mirrors a lot of the good moves that they have made.
Yeah, but the one thing we got to worry about, that you saw it all the time, what happens, we know what injured players do, they stay hurt.
Right, and that's
that is the biggest thing. But yeah, they didn't move any of their players. We've been talking about Budda Baker for over a year when it comes to trade. They weren't going to trade him, and they can't. The way he's playing. Matt Prater would have been nice. You couldn't do it. You can't trade a player that's on IR, and yeah, that decision. I'm guessing one of two things is going to happen with Prater, is that quietly that knee injury that was a short-term thing will suddenly become a rest of the season thing, or they will give him the Zach Ertz treatment and they will activate and release him. allowing him to land with somewhere else. But it was a bummer that the timing wise, because had he been put on IR before the first game he missed, guess what? He'd be eligible now to return, and they could have, in fact, activated him and traded him. But Zay Jones, this just, in terms of redundancy on the roster, you could have traded him, Kelvin Beachum, but they weren't going to trade him because that would have because it looks like the plan for Jonah Williams, that he will return to the lineup after the bye for Seattle. But then you'd have to deal with Charlie Heck for a game against the Jets. But other than that, was there anything else we could have expected other than a bigger name and edge? I just didn't feel like that was going to happen. I didn't think they were going to go make a splash or even target a cornerback because, one, they like Sean Murphy-Bunting, and two, they like the young talent that they have. Garrett Williams is good. Starling Thomas has been productive. Max Melton is ascending, and he's getting better. And so, you look at the other positions, I'm like, what were they going to be able to do? They didn't need to trade for a receiver. They didn't need a running back. And because of what they have on the roster, they don't have an excess in talent that they can just be trading guys, right?
Right. That's the big thing. And so, it's just one of those situations where I feel like they're creating a culture and they're trying to cultivate, and it's tough when you lack talent, but they're getting there. And that's the biggest thing that I'm taking from everything I'm seeing. And that's why they will have the lapses that we saw the other day, right? They still will have those issues, but the reality becomes they have so much talent, or so much togetherness, that it just seems like they're getting to the point now where they're able to consistently put together strong performances, and that's just not something that we expected, right? Let's be honest, we just didn't expect it, man. We didn't expect them to be this physical. We thought that's what they wanted to do, but we didn't expect them to be this physical. We didn't expect them to consistently put this effort out there. And now they're in a position where, I know I hate this saying, but they truly do control their own destiny. And so we wonder how far can they go forward with this group, because so far it's been way more than we expected. This effort this week was just so much more, and to see them come out and play this way, it just feels like they're really close at this point. And I know fans will be like, well, then why didn't they do X, Y, or Z? And I get that. I truly do understand that. But I think that they're holding the line. They're not going to get out over their skis.
They're trusting their process. They can make the post. They could make a run the as is, but they weren't going to make a rash, desperate move and then be locked in and set your roster back and
right.
Yeah. And with that, we'll wrap up this edition of the Rise Up Secret podcast. It's been episode 611. We've got 2 more shows coming up this week. Nick Wooten. Yes, we talked to him when it was the Bills Wire. He also runs the Jets Wire. He runs half of the AFC East. So Nick Wooten, I will preview Cardinals-Jets with later this week, and Seth and I will be back later in the week as well to talk about Cardinals-Jets. Until then, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. Thanks for listening. As always, we'll be back again very soon.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up, See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, rise up, See Red.
Red!